Frank Castle, a former Marine, once had a perfect life with his wife and kids. But everything shattered when they were brutally murdered. Ever since, he's been haunted by their deaths, unable to find peace. His first course of action? Roaming across the country, hunting down every gang member connected to the killings. It doesn't take long before people start calling him the Punisher. Once he's wiped them out, he fakes his own death and disappears from the world. Fast forward 6 months, and Frank has rebranded himself as Pete Castiglione, laying low in New York City. He's got a job at a construction site in Brooklyn, spending his days smashing walls with a sledgehammer, his personal way of letting out all that pent-up rage. Not everyone is thrilled about his presence, especially Lance, a co-worker who's bitter about losing overtime pay because of Frank.
I'm guessing
Lance goes out of his way to mess with him, ruining his lunch, and even tossing some threats his way. Strangely, Frank doesn't react. Among the workers is Donnie, a guy who tries to befriend Frank. He shares his lunch and opens up about losing his parents, hoping to get Frank to talk.
Who hand Luke or something? One man change.
When Donnie learns that Frank was in the Marines, he gets curious and tries to start a conversation about it.
But I knew he wasn't.
Frank, however, shuts it down, making it clear that he's not looking for a buddy. One day, while taking a break, Frank overhears Lance and his friend Paulie whispering about a plan to rob a poker game that's under the protection of a dangerous New York crime family.
Putting your nose where...
They realize Frank is eavesdropping and warn him to stay out of it. Frank, as usual, doesn't engage and brushes them off.
with that hammer? I want to...
Just then, an accident happens. A coworker gets hurt. While others rush to help, Frank just watches. With their friend now out of commission, Lance and Paulie need a third man for their heist.
I do.
They rope Donnie into the plan, convincing him with the promise of easy cash. The three of them head to the basement where the high-stakes poker game is happening. Armed and ready, they burst in, taking everyone hostage. Donnie collects the money, but things take a nasty turn when his wallet slips from his pocket, exposing his identity. The crime family now knows exactly who he is, making him a marked man. Lance and Paulie, furious at Donnie for jeopardizing their whole operation, beat him to a pulp. Realizing that the mob will come after them, they decide to eliminate Donnie to keep him from snitching.
He's got to disappear.
He fights back, but he's outnumbered. They overpower him and throw him into a concrete mixer, ready to let him drown in cement.
Just let me go.
Can't happen, Donnie.
Just as Lance is about to finish the job, Frank steps in. He orders them to shut off the mixer, but when Lance refuses, a brutal fight breaks out. Armed with his trusty sledgehammer, Frank takes him down one by one, each blow knocking them out cold. He doesn't stop there. One by one, he dumps their bodies into the cement. Lance, now begging for his life and offering money, tries to reason with Frank. But Frank isn't buying it. He tortures Lance to extract the location of the poker game, then finishes him off without hesitation. Amidst the chaos, Donnie manages to escape, thanks to a rope Frank throws his way. Meanwhile, the crime family is getting ready to hunt Donnie down when, out of nowhere, the lights cut out. Suddenly, gunfire fills the room. When the gang's leader rushes back in, he finds his men lying lifeless on the ground. Frank steps out from the shadows and swiftly puts a bullet in the boss's head. At the same time, Special Agent Dinah Madani is back in New York after working in Afghanistan.
Partners, sure you're the...
Her top priority? Investigating the murder of her old partner, Ahmad Zubair, an Afghan national police officer. She's convinced that American soldiers were running a heroin operation and killed Zubair when he found out.
Back in the country barely 3 weeks. You already have...
She brings the case to her boss, Special Agent Carson Wolf, but he shuts it down immediately, saying it's off limits.
They pulled you out of there before you did your career somewhere.
Determined not to let it go, Dinah enlists her new partner, Sam Stein, to dig into files about Colonel Schoonover, a massive drug bust at the docks from the year before, and anything connected to one of Schoonover's men,
You know how
Frank Castle. Sam thinks the Punisher is long dead, but Dinah isn't convinced.
Man, Lieutenant Frank Castle.
She finds it suspicious that Frank and Schoonover supposedly died just 20 miles apart in New York.
I'm already on the shit pile.
It's too much of a coincidence for her to ignore. Meanwhile, as Frank walks away from the crime scene, someone is watching him. A man, tracking Frank through surveillance footage, identifies him using gait recognition technology. He calls himself Micro and reveals that he knows Frank is alive.
Yeah.
During their conversation, Frank discovers that Micro is the same person who anonymously left the disc at his house, showing footage of Zubair's execution by American soldiers. Frank demands a face-to-face meeting, but Micro refuses, saying Frank needs to understand that they're on the same side first. Later that night, Frank notices a flashing light from a nearby building. He rushes to the rooftop and finds a flashlight and a mirror rigged up to create the signal. There's also a phone left behind by Micro. As Frank scans the area, he spots Micro watching him from another rooftop. Feeling uneasy, Frank visits Curtis Hoyle, a former Navy corpsman and the only person who knows he's still alive.
This doesn't slip anybody.
He tells Curtis about Micro and the possibility that he holds crucial answers about what really happened to his family.
He said that what happened to Maria and the kids.
If Micro has resurfaced now, it might mean Frank's family was killed for reasons beyond his past missions. Determined to find out more, Frank tracks down Micro's home.
Weird. I get my head blown off.
He comes up with a plan. He deliberately steps in front of Micro's wife Sarah's car, faking an accident. To sell it, he even cuts his forehead with a razor. Sarah, horrified, takes him inside to help. As they talk, she reminisces about her husband's supposed death, unaware that Micro has hidden cameras all over the house,
knocking you down and
watching them. Seeing Frank with his wife sends Micro into a panic. He fears Frank might hurt his family, so he rushes home, waiting outside in the shadows.
No, Castle, you asshole!
However, instead of harming anyone, Frank helps Sarah fix her broken headlight and leaves, giving Micro the chance to slip away unnoticed.
Come on.
That night, Frank shaves his beard and alters his posture to avoid being recognized through gait tracking. Later, Frank sneaks into Carson Wolf's house and catches him off guard. He beats him up, ties him to a chair, and starts asking questions about Micro. Wolf, however, claims Micro was a traitor and deserved to die. Not satisfied with that answer, Frank shoots him in the leg and demands the truth.
Still resisting arrest! Ah, shit!
Wolf eventually admits that Frank's family wasn't just collateral damage. They were killed on purpose. The plan was to eliminate Frank, but they threw in extra bodies to make it seem random.
Now.
When Frank asks why they wanted him dead, Wolf reveals that they suspected Frank was the one who leaked the tape to Micro. Realizing he won't get any more answers, Frank finishes Wolf off, snapping his neck.
Just you, man, the truth.
The next day, Frank sits in a diner, waiting. His phone rings. It's Micro. The first thing Micro wants to know is why Frank showed up at his house. Frank doesn't sugarcoat it. He tells Micro that by digging too deep, he put his family in danger.
Saying that, right?
I know why you gave it to me, but I wasn't gonna.
Frank then tells Micro to meet him at a cemetery. But when Micro arrives, Curtis is the one waiting.
Hold on.
Curtis warns him that if he keeps looking for Frank, there will be consequences. Frustrated, Micro heads back to his hideout, only to realize too late that Frank had been hiding in his trunk the whole time. Before he can react, Frank knocks him unconscious. When Micro wakes up, he finally shares his story. He recounts the day Carson Wolf and his men came for him.
Guys like us.
Knowing he was in trouble, he told his family to stay in the car and tried to escape. But Wolf caught up to him near a river, accused him of being a traitor, and shot him. The
NSA analyst!
bullet, however, hit a phone in Micro's pocket, saving his life.
I went underground.
Since then, he's been on the run, knowing that Homeland Security still sees him as a threat. In a revealing flashback, it turns out that Micro had received a CD containing footage of Ahad Zubair's murder.
Alright. Thanks.
As an analyst, he couldn't just ignore it. He had to review the content. Realizing how serious the situation was, he decided to take action and forwarded the evidence to Dinah Madani. This move put a target on his back, particularly from Homeland Security, where Carson Wolf, who was already aware of Zubair's killing, had his sights set on him. Jumping back to the present, Frank has Micro tied to a chair, stripped down, and is grilling him for answers.
You know, she said you were brave.
Out of nowhere, a 3-minute countdown starts. Micro quickly explains it's a failsafe. If the timer hits 0, live camera feeds will broadcast the footage to various media outlets.
Smile, Frank, you're on candid camera.
The only way to stop it is with a code and a retinal scan. While Frank is focused on him, Micro seizes the moment and injects him with a sedative. Frank blacks out. When he comes to, he realizes Micro hasn't killed him, which raises even more questions. Micro, in turn, tries to convince Frank that they should work together to expose the people responsible for Zubair's death, as well as the ones who murdered Frank's family.
Why not kill you, Jesus?
Frank begins piecing things together, recalling a mission back in Afghanistan called Cerberus. During this mission, his squad captured Ahad Zubair. A CIA operative known as Agent Orange took over from there, brutally torturing Zubair for intel about a heroin operation.
So what did you warrior?
The conversations happened in Persian, making it clear that none of Frank's team had a clue about Zubair's innocence or Orange's involvement in drug trafficking. Ultimately, Orange ordered Frank to execute Zubair and dispose of the body. An order Frank regretfully followed. Days later, Frank and his squad received a briefing from Schoonover and Orange. Right from the start, Frank suspected something was off. He voiced his concerns, but they were brushed aside. His fears were confirmed when the mission turned into an ambush. Schoonover lost an arm, and the team was caught in a deadly firefight. Fueled by rage, Frank took charge, clearing a path for the team's escape. Later, as they were being treated in the medical tent, all Orange cared about was whether they had taken out the target.
The target.
What Frank and the others didn't know was that the entire mission was a setup. Orange orchestrated it to wipe out anyone who knew about Zubair's murder. Enraged by Orange's indifference, Frank snapped and attacked him, leaving him blind in one eye. Back in the present, Micro reveals to Frank that the operation he was part of wasn't authorized. It had no official records and zero approval from Congress,
And their server, phone companies, police.
making it completely illegal. Frank agrees to team up with Micro, but under one condition. Every target must be eliminated. No trials, no loose ends. Micro agrees. Now they need weapons. Micro hacks into the NYPD system and discovers an illegal arms shipment arriving from Greece,
I don't care if we trust each other or not. I don't want to be.
set to be purchased by a buyer from Turkey. To get to the shipment, they decide to hijack another gang's operation. After a violent confrontation that leaves several gang members dead and one of their captives rescued, Frank and Micro take off in separate cars.
If you scream, you die.
Frank tracks down Turk at gunpoint, demanding info on the weapons. But Turk throws a wrench in his plan. The Greeks have already secured another buyer willing to purchase the entire shipment. The only thing Turk can offer is a pink gun intended as a gift for a gangster's daughter. Frustrated, Frank heads back to the hideout, where he starts cleaning both Micro's pistol and the pink gun. Meanwhile, Dinah briefs her team on their next move. They plan to pose as buyers to intercept the weapons from the Greeks.
For disaster.
And call Harbor Patrol.
Using his hacking skills, Micro pinpoints the shipment's new location. As night falls, the operation kicks off. Dinah tails the truck in one car, while other officers, including Sam, wait at the destination. Suddenly, their comms go haywire, and an unfamiliar song plays over the radio. Unable to communicate through their usual channels, Dinah calls Sam, urging him to stay focused.
Do you copy? Please respond.
She quickly realizes they're being fed a loop. She's passed the same location 3 times. While all this unfolds, Frank hijacks the truck and orders Micro to drive it back to their hideout.
Stay in position. That's an order.
Frank follows closely behind. Dinah, refusing to let the truck slip away, races after them. Frank, realizing she won't give up, blocks her path, leading to an intense chase. Dinah, proving she's just as skilled, manages to lose him, only to reappear right in front of his car. Both accelerate, preparing for a showdown, but things take a disastrous turn. Micro, trying to evade the pursuit, crashes into Dinah's car. Furious, Frank lashes out at Micro for causing the accident, but there's no time to argue. Acting fast, Frank pulls Dinah from the wreckage, moving her away from the burning vehicle. As she regains consciousness, she recognizes Frank and asks if he killed Wolf.
Stop that.
Without hesitation, Frank confirms it, calling Wolf a corrupt agent. Before leaving, he warns her to stay out of his way. Now armed with the stolen shipment, Frank still lacks crucial information, Agent Orange's real identity. To uncover the truth, he seeks out Gunnar Henderson,
She would have seen your face. She was unconscious.
the man who filmed Zoo Bear's execution. Like Frank and Micro, Gunnar has gone off the grid, keeping a low profile to avoid being hunted by Agent Orange.
You got it?
Frank tracked him down in a secluded forest, but before he can even get close, Gunnar ambushes him with an arrow. Wounded, Frank takes cover behind a tree, shouting that he's not an enemy. As Gunnar approaches, Frank finally reveals who he is and explains that his family was killed because of the footage.
Scoot over. He betrayed us.
Recognizing an old ally, Gunnar lowers his weapon and agrees to talk. When asked about Agent Orange's real name, Gunnar admits he doesn't know. Before they can continue, the sound of an approaching helicopter interrupts them. Soldiers descend into the forest. Watching the operation unfold through the soldiers' helmet cameras, Agent Orange, now the CIA's deputy director, orchestrates the mission from afar. His goal is simple: eliminate everyone who witnessed Zoo Bear's execution. Since the mission was never officially documented, there are no records of who was present. However, after eavesdropping on Dinah's conversation with Sam, Orange learned about Gunnar and sent a team to take him out. As the soldiers close in, Gunnar takes them by surprise, using his bow and traps to injure several of them. Frank finishes the job. Watching from the feed, Agent Orange is stunned to see that Frank is still alive. The fight intensifies, Gunnar is shot twice, and Frank runs out of bullets. They take cover behind a rock as more soldiers advance. Micro, monitoring the scene via drone, warns Frank about incoming threats. Thanks to Micro's guidance, they manage to neutralize the remaining soldiers. Frank then addresses Agent Orange through the camera, delivering a chilling message. He's coming for him. To make his point, he snaps the last soldier's neck. Though they survive the attack, Frank and Gunnar are critically wounded. As night falls, they push forward, but Gunnar ultimately succumbs to his injuries. Micro arrives just in time, tending to Frank's wounds and transporting him out of the forest. While unconscious, Frank has a dream. He's at a dinner table, surrounded by his family and Micros. It's a happy gathering until, in a terrifying twist, soldiers storm in and gun everyone down before his eyes. Frank wakes up in a panic, only to find Micro treating his injuries.
Bury me, man.
Micro updates Frank. Someone's been broadcasting his name all day, calling him Raven, a code Billy Russo used back in the day.
I've been given.
Micro worries that Billy now knows Frank is alive. Frank isn't concerned. He sees Billy as a friend, convinced they protect each other.
Blackbird to Raven. Blackbird calling back.
Meanwhile, Dinah investigates the scene where Gunnar was killed. Thanks to Micro tipping off the local authorities, Gunnar's body is found. However, the soldiers' bodies were taken away by their handlers. Piecing things together, Dinah suspects Frank was there and likely made the police call.
Got wounds. But then he calls the...
Her theory is confirmed when Sam informs her that a blood sample from the site matches Frank's. Realizing just how dangerous this situation is, Dinah turns to Billy Russo. She tells him Frank is alive and in bad shape, hoping he'll help her track him down. Billy, familiar with the Afghanistan case, pretends to agree. Later, he visits Curtis, a mutual friend of his and Frank's, trying to get a lead on Frank's location.
We need some help with this, Billy. What do you mean? How about...
But Curtis plays it cool, acting like he knows nothing. Billy makes it clear that he's not interested in helping the government. His loyalty lies with Frank.
I found out, now I gotta find him.
He offers Frank a way out, a fresh identity and a quiet life somewhere far away. Once Billy leaves, Curtis drops by to see Frank and fills him in on what went down with Billy. He's convinced that Frank should take the deal, seeing it as a rare opportunity to escape the constant threat of Agent Orange and finally find peace.
Conversation.
The next day, Frank and Billy meet up by the river, catching up after a long time apart. Billy talks about his company and mentions his conversation with Dina, curious to know what Frank might have shared with her. In response, Frank spills everything. How Agent Orange, Schoonover, and Bennett were trafficking heroin from Afghanistan by hiding it inside the bodies of fallen soldiers.
Like shit.
Can't all be...
Billy, being a true friend, urges Frank to let Dina handle the case, reminding him that she's after the same people. Before parting, Billy extends an invitation. He has a boat ready to get Frank out of the city that night. Meanwhile, Micro stays put in his hideout, patiently waiting. On the other side, Frank reaches out to Sarah, apologizing for missing her dinner invitation. Their conversation takes a personal turn, and Sarah opens up about the struggles of raising Zach without David. Frank offers her some comforting words, though the moment weighs heavily on Micro, who watches from afar, feeling guilty for being absent from his family's life.
I don't know how to stop that hurt.
As night falls, Billy waits at the dock, expecting Frank to show up, but Frank never arrives. Disappointed, Billy gets back in his car and updates his contact, saying Frank won't be coming. But the real twist? The person he's talking to is none other than Agent Orange. Turns out, Billy has been working with him all along and is determined to take Frank out as soon as possible.
House.
The next evening, Colonel Bennett, a key player in the drug smuggling operation, sits down for dinner when Frank unexpectedly crashes the scene. Frank wants information on Agent Orange's identity and puts pressure on Bennett, though it's really just a distraction to give Micro enough time to clone Bennett's phone.
Please don't kill me!
Billy, already anticipating that Frank would come after Bennett, waits outside with his team. As Frank moves in, Micro keeps an eye on the situation through a drone, warning Frank about the incoming danger. Thinking on his feet, Frank fills the room with gas, disorienting Billy's men and throwing off their aim. One by one, Frank takes them down. Billy, keeping his face covered, remains unrecognizable to Frank. In the chaos, Billy accidentally shoots one of his own men, giving Frank an opening to escape. With the phone cloning complete, Micro gains access to Bennett's communications, allowing them to track his movements. The next day, Billy takes Bennett to Agent Orange's safe house, furious about being used as bait.
To a corner, William.
And now I'm getting you out of it.
Bennett, meanwhile, assures Agent Orange that he hasn't given Frank any intel. Sensing that Bennett has outlived his usefulness, Agent Orange decides it's time to eliminate him.
Did he take anything?
The plan? Send him out of the country so Frank can't find him. To make sure he can't be tracked, Bennett is ordered to leave his phone behind while Billy personally escorts him to a new location. Micro, still monitoring the phone, gathers valuable intel on the safe house. Over at her office, Dina is deep in thought when she suddenly realizes something. Her office might be bugged. She confides in Sam, connecting the dots. Every time they discuss something important, things went south, like when they talked about Gunner, and he ended up dead the next day. Suspicious, she starts searching for listening devices and eventually finds one hidden on a shelf. Instead of removing it, she decides to leave it in place to avoid tipping off whoever planted it. Meanwhile, Billy takes Bennett to a secluded motel upstate. During their conversation, Bennett lets slip that he never really liked Billy or any of the Special Forces guys.
All right.
Yeah, good thing self.
Then, he makes a horrifying discovery. The woman he spent the night with is lying dead under the sheets. Realizing he's being framed, he goes for his gun, but Billy is faster. In a brutal move, Billy overpowers him and stabs him repeatedly until he's dead. Elsewhere, Frank stakes out the safe house and gets a shot at Agent Orange, but the bulletproof glass saves him. Even though the attack fails, Frank finally learns his target's true identity. William Rollins, the head of the CIA's covert operations. The following day, the cameras at Micro's house suddenly go offline. Worried, Frank checks in, only to find out that Sarah had turned off the internet to teach Zach a lesson. Relieved that everything's okay, he gets ready to leave, but then something unexpected happens. Sarah tries to kiss him. Completely caught off guard, Frank pulls away, creating an awkward moment. Micro, watching through the cameras, witnesses the whole thing, making things even more tense between them. Though uncomfortable, Micro doesn't blame Frank, knowing he wasn't at fault.
But for some reason, Sarah's just...
Eager to reunite with his wife, Micro suggests reaching out to Dina, thinking she might be their best shot at taking down Agent Orange. With the evidence and a witness on their side, they might finally be able to arrest him, giving Micro a chance to go back to his family.
Keep on going, you're a psychopath.
But Frank is firm. Agent Orange has to die. Micro loses it, blaming Frank for his family's death and accusing him of wanting everyone else to suffer too. In a desperate move, he tries to call Dina, but Frank steps in and knocks him out. Meanwhile, Dina and Sam set a trap for the people bugging her office.
You know, you need me to sit with his prettiness.
They stage a fake tactical plan about a weapons heist involving Frank, knowing that whoever's listening will take the bait. Sure enough, Billy falls for it and meets up with Agent Orange to plan their next move.
Everything checks out. Jack DeLeo.
They decide it's time to eliminate Frank for good. Billy gathers a team of mercenaries, luring them in with the promise of a big payday if they succeed.
Bunch of Iraqi civilians.
As expected, Dina's trap works. Billy and his crew walk right into an ambush, leading to a massive shootout between Homeland Security and Billy's men. In the chaos, most of Billy's team is wiped out. Realizing things are going south, Billy makes a run for it. He even kills one of his own men to cover his tracks. During his escape, Sam intercepts him, holding him at gunpoint. Seeing no other choice, Billy pretends to surrender, letting Sam disarm him. But just when Sam lets his guard down, Billy pulls out a concealed blade and stabs him multiple times. Before Dina arrives, Billy vanishes, leaving Sam bleeding out on the ground. Dina rushes to his side, desperately trying to stop the bleeding, but Sam has already lost too much blood. Despite her efforts, he doesn't make it. Meanwhile, on a different front, we're introduced to Lewis, a U.S. Army veteran struggling to readjust to civilian life. Haunted by PTSD, he once tried to harm his own father and even attempted suicide, but survived. Unable to sleep in a normal bed, he dug a foxhole in his backyard and slept there instead. Searching for purpose, he looked to Billy's private military company, Anvil, hoping for a fresh start. But Billy, aware of Lewis's mental instability, rejected him. At his father's insistence, Lewis reluctantly started attending a veteran support group led by Curtis. There, he met O'Connor, a supposed Vietnam War vet who preached extremist views. Lewis, already feeling abandoned by his country, found himself drawn to O'Connor's ideology, believing that the system had turned against those who once served it. Inspired by O'Connor's rhetoric, Lewis joined him in a protest outside the Bronx County Courthouse. They were there to support a teacher facing charges for bringing a gun into his classroom. A police officer, suspicious of their intentions, approached them, asking if they were protesting. Lewis insisted they were just handing out pamphlets, claiming they had every right to be there. O'Connor, however, had his own reasons for being there, setting the stage for something much darker. Fa took it as a protest and demanded they leave immediately. But Lewis refused, standing firm, arguing they weren't blocking anyone from getting into the courthouse. Fa wasn't having it, though, and kept insisting they go. Trying to defuse the situation, OK Connor suggested grabbing a coffee, but that only made Fa angrier. Suddenly, Fa accused Lewis of reaching for his gun, a claim Lewis flat out denied. Lewis tried calling OK Connor as a witness, but he was already gone. He watched as OK Connor walked away, leaving him alone with Fa. The next thing he knew, Fa shoved him to the ground and slapped the cuffs on him. Later, Lewis started digging into OK Connor's military background and discovered something shocking. OK Connor had never actually served in the Vietnam War. When Lewis confronted him with the proof, OK Connor denied it, saying the records must have been tampered with. But Lewis wasn't buying it. When Lewis refused to let it go, OK Connor lost it and told him to get out of his house. Things escalated quickly, turning into a full-blown fight. Desperate, OK Connor grabbed a knife and slashed Lewis across the stomach. But Lewis fought back, managing to overpower him. Fueled by rage, he stabbed OK Connor multiple times, killing him. The weight of what he'd done crushed Lewis. Overcome with guilt and unable to cope, he considered ending his own life but just couldn't go through with it. Instead, he decided to take matters into his own hands in a different way. He went to a hardware store, bought materials, and started making homemade bombs. Once everything was ready, Lewis set off explosions all over New York City, hitting a police station, a federal courthouse, and a field office. In the middle of all the chaos, he sent a letter to a lawyer named Karen. He wanted her to understand his point of view, believing she was the only one who could. In his manifesto, he justified his actions, claiming he was fighting to protect American freedoms from a corrupt government. He even threatened to bomb the New York Bulletin if Karen didn't publish his words. Karen, however, had no interest in spreading his message. Instead, she wrote an editorial slamming him, making it clear she despised everything he stood for. Meanwhile, Frank found out about the bombings from the news. When he read Karen's article, he became worried that she was putting herself in danger. Karen later appeared on a radio show alongside Senator Stan, where she strongly condemned Lewis's actions. While listening to the show, Lewis got mad, believing Karen and Stan were siding with the enemy. He called in and warned them that they were on the wrong side of the fight before hanging up. Realizing Karen was now a target, Frank told Micro to track down Lewis immediately. Micro was confused. Why was Frank so focused on this instead of their own mission? That's when Frank admitted that Karen was like family to him, and he wouldn't let anything happen to her. Meanwhile, Curtis decided to check in on OK Connor since he hadn't heard from him in days. When he got to the house, the door was locked, and there was a terrible smell coming from inside. When he finally made it in, he found OK Connor's dead body slumped on the sofa, exactly where Lewis had left him. As Curtis looked around, he realized the place was rigged with explosives. Before he could react, Lewis attacked him. A brutal struggle followed, and Lewis tortured Curtis mercilessly. Not long after, Frank arrived, finding Curtis tied to a chair with a bomb strapped to his chest. Lewis called Curtis's phone, and Frank answered. The two of them engaged in a twisted mind game. Lewis admired Frank's brutal methods and wanted to work together, but Frank played along, pretending to agree just to get the information he needed. Eventually, Lewis told him which wire to cut to defuse the bomb. Right then, the police showed up. Thinking fast, Frank took down one cop with a rock and incapacitated the other before making his escape in a stolen police car. But when he got back to the hideout, he was in for a nasty surprise. His face was all over the news. Thanks to dash cam footage, the whole country now thought he was responsible for the bombings, branding him a terrorist. The next day, while Karen was interviewing Stan, an explosion suddenly rocked the room, sending both of them flying. Smoke filled the air as chaos erupted. Lewis and Frank went head-to-head, taking down security guards left and right. Despite his injuries, Stan managed to grab his gun and fire at Lewis before making his escape. Karen, however, was left alone with Lewis. Later, when Senator Stan recounted the incident to Detective Sergeant Brett Mahoney, Karen cut in, saying his version of events was completely wrong. She then told the real story. Lewis had stormed in with a gun, taking down anyone who got in his way. Stan tried to run, but Lewis caught him at gunpoint. Karen scrambled to grab her pistol from her bag, but it had been knocked away in the explosion. Just as Lewis was about to kill them both, Frank burst into the room, shielding Karen from the shot. Karen saw her chance. She lunged for her gun, but Stan, desperate to save himself, pushed her towards Lewis as a human shield. Frank aimed his gun at Lewis, but Lewis revealed he was holding a bomb and could detonate it with the press of a button. Security guards arrived, forcing Frank and the others to surrender while Lewis took the elevator. Meanwhile, a separate story unfolded. The day before, Dina had been investigating the people who attacked Frank the night Sam was killed. She discovered that they all had connections to Billy's company. Suspicious, she confronted Billy, but he denied any wrongdoing. He admitted they were ex-employees, but claimed the company had no ties to them anymore. Before they could argue further, alarms blared. The building was under attack. Everyone assumed Frank was responsible, but Dina believed otherwise. She rushed to find him and suggested they work together to expose Agent Orange. Frank, however, insisted on handling it alone. Right then, Frank was shot by none other than his old friend, Billy. That's when Billy revealed his true allegiance, confessing that he was working with Agent Orange. He pulled his gun on Dina, warning her to step aside so he could finish Frank off. Before he could pull the trigger, security stormed in, arresting all three of them. Just as Frank was about to be taken into custody, he made a daring escape, using a fire hose to slide down the building. Meanwhile, Lewis had dragged Karen into the kitchen, holding her hostage and threatening to blow everything up. Frank soon joined them. While Lewis was distracted, Frank signaled Karen to cut the white wire on his bomb. Karen quickly followed his lead, disarming the bomb and shooting Lewis in the foot through her bag. Realizing he was out of options, Lewis locked himself in a storage room. With no way out, he rewired the bomb and set off an explosion. Karen and Frank barely made it out before the whole place collapsed. On the other side of town, a cop showed up at Sarah's house after receiving a tip about Frank. It turned out that Zach, after seeing Frank's face on the news, had called the police. The officer questioned Sarah about Frank's visits, but she played dumb, saying it must be a misunderstanding. The cop then asked about her daughter, Leo. Sarah claimed Leo was staying with friends, but in reality, she was upstairs, watching everything unfold. When the officer told Sarah she needed to come to the station, she got a bad feeling. Sensing trouble, she whispered for Zach to run. That's when the officer dropped the act and revealed his true intentions. He lunged at them, but Sarah fought back, grabbing a knife. Just as she gained the upper hand, another officer grabbed Zach, forcing her to surrender. Meanwhile, Micro was watching the news when he saw Billy spinning a story, painting Frank as a terrorist to the entire country. As Frank steps into Micro's house, something feels off. Signs of a struggle catch his eye, and after checking the security footage, the truth hits him hard. Sarah and Zach have been kidnapped. It doesn't take long for Frank to put the pieces together. Sarah has his number, which means Billy can track their location. Their hideout isn't safe anymore. Knowing a confrontation is unavoidable, Frank wastes no time gearing up. He carefully stashes weapons in different spots, loads up his guns, slips on a bulletproof vest, and waits for the inevitable attack. Right on cue, the mercenaries show up, ready to take him out. What they don't realize is that they aren't just dealing with Frank Castle. They're up against the Punisher, back and more ruthless than ever. He launches a brutal ambush, taking them out one by one. In a gruesome move, he beheads one of them and tosses the head at the others, causing chaos. The explosion that follows leaves a couple of attackers injured, making it even easier for Frank to finish the rest. With his sharp combat skills, he dodges their attacks effortlessly, striking with deadly accuracy and leaving a pile of bodies behind. Once the dust settles, Frank rummages through the mercenaries' belongings and finds a phone to call Billy. On the other end, Billy doesn't waste time taunting him. Sarah and Zach are with him, and if Frank and Micro want them back, they have to surrender. A meeting is set for the next day. That night, Frank reunites with Dina, Micro, and Leo, who has finally made it back to her father's side after dodging law enforcement. Trusting Dina wasn't part of Frank's plan, but since Micro vouched for her, he decides to take a leap of faith. The next day, the exchange takes place under tense conditions. Sarah and Zach are forced to wear fuel-soaked vests, making every step they take towards Frank and Micro even more terrifying. Sarah hesitates, struggling to believe that Micro is actually alive. Meanwhile, Frank keeps his eyes locked on Billy, knowing that the sniper rifle aimed at him leaves zero room for deception. Things take a turn for the worse when Billy's men set the fuel ablaze. Thinking fast, Micro tears off his jacket and smothers the flames before they spread. Before Homeland Security can step in, Frank is knocked unconscious, and Micro takes a fatal bullet from one of the agents. As he collapses, Sarah's heart-wrenching scream echoes as she shields her son from witnessing the horror of his father's supposed death. Micro's body is taken to Homeland Security, but in a shocking twist, he's still alive. Turns out, the whole thing was a carefully crafted plan. Frank was supposed to help Dina capture Billy and Agent Orange, but his sudden unconsciousness throws everything off. Whether intentional or not, it's clear that Frank had a different goal. He didn't want them arrested. He wanted them dead. Despite the setback, Micro is eventually reunited with his family in an emotional embrace. Meanwhile, Frank isn't so lucky. Billy has taken him straight to their hideout, where Agent Orange is waiting. Tied to a chair, Frank remains defiant, vowing to wipe them all out. Agent Orange, eager to make him suffer, puts on a pair of reinforced gloves and starts beating him senseless, determined to break him. At the same time, a hacker is called in to wipe everything from Micro's system. But even through the pain, Frank just laughs in Orange's face. Back at the safe house, Micro fills Dina in on the real plan. Frank never intended to let these guys live. Their deal was simple. Micro would give Frank the chance to kill them all. They knew Billy would bring Frank to their hideout. And since Micro was out of the picture, the only way to access the computers was through Frank's retinal scan. Using Dina's system, Micro hacks into the hideout's CCTV feed and watches in horror as Frank gets beaten to a pulp. But Frank's plan is still in motion. If he can't kill them, at least his death will be recorded, leaving undeniable proof of their crimes. Desperate, Micro urges Dina to step in and help him. Meanwhile, Frank finally gives in and scans his eye to unlock the system. But he isn't done yet. Seizing his moment, he grabs a hidden knife and buries it in Agent Orange's chest. Before he can go any further, Billy steps in and pistol whips him, knocking him to the ground. Just as Billy is about to finish him off, Dina and her team arrive, forcing him to retreat. Frank barely makes it out alive, but Billy slips away yet again. Billy, now wounded, makes a beeline for his office, gathering cash and a fake passport. But Homeland Security is already on his trail. He ambushes them, taking out the agents before setting off a bomb that destroys the entire office. While Billy escapes, Frank is saved thanks to emergency surgery performed by Dina's father. In the aftermath, Micro hands Frank a wad of cash stolen from their enemies' accounts and advises him to leave the country for a fresh start. Later that night, Curtis, fast asleep, is awakened by an uninvited guest, Billy. Holding a gun, Billy demands to know where Frank is. When Curtis admits he knew Frank was alive all along, Billy is devastated. One friend tried to kill him, and another betrayed him by keeping secrets. The moment is cut short when a bullet suddenly pierces the building, barely missing Billy. Enraged, he fires back, hitting Curtis in the shoulder. But this was all part of Frank's setup. Watching from a nearby building, Frank patiently waits for Billy to step into view. The second Billy moves and his knife becomes visible, Frank fires, pinning him down. Realizing escape is nearly impossible, Billy reluctantly answers a call from Frank, who warns him not to hurt Curtis. They agree to meet at their old hangout spot, the park, a place filled with memories of better times. When Billy arrives at the park, he takes 2 employees hostage, using them as leverage. Frank approaches cautiously, spotting 2 teenagers tied to the carousel. Thinking fast, he fires shots in the opposite direction to distract Billy before sneaking in from another angle. The park turns into a war zone as gunfire erupts between them. Moving stealthily around the carousel, Frank lines up the perfect shot and fires, hitting Billy in the mouth. Billy, in agony, spits out the bullet and staggers backward. In a desperate move, he grabs one of the teenagers and threatens to kill them unless Frank surrenders. Left with no choice, Frank drops his weapons. Just as Billy prepares to strike, Dina arrives, drawing his attention. In the chaos, Frank charges at Billy, disarming him. The two engage in a brutal fistfight, but Frank quickly gains the upper hand, relentlessly pummeling Billy. To make things worse, he drags Billy's face across shattered glass, leaving him battered and bloodied. Billy, barely able to speak, begs Frank to finish him. But Frank refuses. Killing Billy would be too easy. He wants him to live with the pain and scars forever. Billy, left severely injured, is taken away while Dina is rescued. Frank, despite everything, is arrested but later granted a new identity in exchange for his silence. Meanwhile, Billy undergoes multiple surgeries, his face hidden beneath layers of bandages. Whether he'll recover mentally or seek revenge remains an open question, but one thing is certain. This war between them isn't over yet.